In this presentation, we look at the role of form follows function in golf course design. And if you'd like to picture the farmland that's just immediately behind me as potential areas to lay out a golf course, you can think of how does a hole follow the landforms and the roles of the land. Well, that's part of form follows function. And then if you look further in the background, you can see the Columbus City skyline. And as an introduction to this concept of form follows function, I'm going to discuss the building of skyscrapers. All right, and many of these pictures that I took were from Chicago, which is one of the epicenters of where the building of skyscrapers actually got its start. But many of these architectural principles that I'll discuss with skyscrapers are applied to golf course design. As background, I'm going to look at how form follows function in the evolution of skyscraper design and how it applies to golf course design. From the earliest times, man has wanted to build big buildings, from the Egyptian pyramids to the cathedrals in Europe to the skyscrapers of now. The actual building of skyscrapers was not possible until the latter part of the 19th century. Prior to the skyscrapers, buildings like the pyramids and the cathedrals were built with stone or masonry walls that supported the weight of the building, which was called load-bearing walls. How high these buildings could be built was limited by how massive the base could be. Two events occurred that changed this. The first was the invention and development of a public safe elevator in 1853 by Elisha Graves Otis, which if you ride the building elevators around campus, you may actually notice the word Otis on some of these elevators. And the second, in the case of Chicago for example, was the fire of 1871. The fire of 1871 leveled the city to rubbish, which would serve as a blank slate for rebuilding the city. The Great Fire, as one might have expected, would result in a slow recovery, but actually the opposite happened. Rapid population growth occurred. Given the land constraints of Chicago, with Lake Michigan on one side and the Chicago River, the only option for handling the Chicago boom was building up. This required new construction methods that required materials like steel, cement, and glass. The early skyscrapers were influenced by European design philosophies. Art Deco, which originated in France, was popular in the 1920s and 30s. The characteristics of this design were sculpture and decorative art. Skyscrapers built at this time reflected this design philosophy. The building with the gold dome is the Intercontinental Hotel in Chicago, and the building with the American flag is the Tribune Building, which were completed in 1929 and 1925 respectively, represented this style of Art Deco during this period. During the 1920s and 30s, the philosophy of modern architecture began to emerge that was rooted in the German design school, Bauhaus. We were entering the Great Depression, and building ornamentation and sculpture was seen by architects of the modern school as expensive and having no value. The idea of modernism was form follows function. In other words, the primary aspect of a building should be on function or purpose. Modern architecture, sometimes were referred to as minimalist, would construct a skyscraper of just glass and steel with no ornamentation. The international style of architecture would emerge from modern architecture, where buildings were rectangular, stripped of all ornamentation, with open interior spaces. The downside to this type of architecture is it gets boring pretty quickly. Buildings begin to look the same. Realizing that buildings were becoming boring and actually to the public standoffish, architects began to add ornamentation to break up the monotony of these buildings. And this was the basis for the postmodern architectural design philosophy. Thus, postmodern architecture incorporated art with function. Postmodern design originated in the 1950s, but did not become real popular until the 1970s. Here the Aqua building in Chicago was completed in 2010 and represents postmodern architecture. In summary, we have seen the progression of skyscraper architecture through the various phases of Art Deco, modern or minimalistic, and postmodern as philosophical categories to classify architects or buildings. Yet, like any categorization, it is often hard to characterize buildings that incorporate different design philosophies. As we look at golf course design and try to categorize a golf course or an architect, we look at some of the same characteristic principles found in building skyscrapers. Form follows function is much more organic in golf course design because you are dealing with a living environment. To route a golf course, you look at the land that you have been given and then match those elements necessary for features needed for a golf hole. For example, plateaus may serve as a place for greens, while smaller ones might serve as tees, and flat, broader areas would serve as landing areas or fairways. In this instance, a plateau serves as a natural place for a green. In this case, a natural plateau just beyond the gorge provides an ideal spot for a green, while the tee which we are standing on is a small plateau. In this picture, a large flat area serves as a landing area or fairway for our tee shots. The same can be said here. And sometimes form leads to a functional hole. In this case, this is a par 3 with a 400-foot draw. The great golf courses that were built prior to World War II followed the flow of the land, or form follows function, like shown here at Pine Valley. Sometimes golf courses become boring, or the same like this golf hole, which looks like a landing strip for a 747. Although the surrounding scenery here in Salmon, Idaho is spectacular, if you had a bunch of these types of holes, it gets boring quickly, kind of like our skyscrapers. After World War II, the advent of the bulldozer and dynamite allowed us to shape the land to whatever we might want it to be. Maybe like the building elevator and new building materials allowed us to experiment with building skyscrapers. During the 1990s and 2000s, often we got away from the minimalist type designs for the flashy, eye-catching types that would appear on the front cover of golf magazines. Many of these golf holes appeared artificial. I find nothing wrong with the flash or eye-catching features, especially when it reduces the potential for being boring. For example, this is a par 3 hole at Coeur d'Alene in Idaho. The green sitting out on this lake was basically constructed on a barge, which can be moved closer or further away from the shoreline, and to get to the green, you take a ferry. But sometimes the lengths that design have been taken pushes the limit. This is an aerial photograph of Shadow Creek Golf Club outside of Las Vegas. Tens of thousands of trees were planted on this golf course, out in the middle of a desert. It goes to show what ingenuity and a lot of money can do to build a golf course in an environment where it doesn't really fit. Before it was shut down, this was a Tiger Woods golf club being built in Dubai. This is one of the holes where I think form takes an extreme. On this course, thousands of trees and ornamental plant material was planted, none of which was native or even adapted to the environment. At this time, Tiger was paid an unbelievable sum of $26 million to design this golf course. This is a golf club in Germany. Actually, it's in the former East German part of Germany. There are two 18-hole courses. The one we're looking at right now is called Winston Golf. And for the most part, I think it gives the idea of how form follows function. Now with the use of bulldozers and such, we can just about create anything we would like. This is the Winston Links during construction, which is the second 18-hole golf course at this German golf club. As you can see, a huge amount of soil is being moved, along with a huge amount of sand being trucked into this site to create links type features, with holes that are quite dramatic, but no doubt unimaginable prior to earth-moving equipment. With the market crash of 2008, golf design is returning to a more natural type of design philosophy. Many of the architects like Tom Doak and Ben Crenshaw are returning to a more form follows function and stripping away much of the flash or artificial look of golf course design. I would say that, like skyscrapers, because you may use minimalist design principles does not necessarily mean cheaper. This is a new golf course designed by Tom Doak called Terry Eady in New Zealand. Although a minimalist type of design, it was expensive. When I was there, the course was still under construction, which you may be able to tell from this picture. The cost of the time had already surpassed tens of millions of dollars.